The first night the storm rolled in over Willow Creek, the widow didn't light her lantern. She sat by the window in silence, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, her reflection flickering faintly in the rain-slicked glass. The night air was heavy and restless, pressing against the walls like a memory trying to get in. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low, and with it came the whisper of a name she hadn't dared to say aloud in months. Henry. Eleanor Graves had been a wife for 20 years, and a widow for 6 months. And yet every corner of the house still felt like he was in it. His hat still hung by the door. His boots still stood by the hearth. She'd tried once to pack them away, but the moment her hands touched the worn leather, she dropped to her knees and wept like the storm had broken through her chest. Since then, she'd left everything as it was, as if he might walk back through that door and ask for supper like he always did. The world outside her window was turning wild again. The rain had come down in sheets, pelting the parched ground until the earth groaned beneath it. The wind tore through the trees and rattled the old barn doors. Every sound reminded her of those nights she and Henry had waited out the tempests together, sitting shoulder to shoulder, laughing at the thunder like it was some old friend testing their strength. But now, without him, every clap of thunder sounded like the heavens cracking open for her loneliness to spill through. She had not slept properly in 5 nights. The bed felt too large, the house too hollow, her dreams too cruel. And so she sat awake, listening to the wind drag its fingers across the window pane, wishing it would take her grief with it. Then, just past midnight, through the thick black veil of the storm, she saw a light. Faint at first, a distant shimmer moving down the trail from the ridge. She leaned forward, heart thudding, trying to make sense of it. The glow grew brighter, swaying with the uneven rhythm of a horse's gait. A rider, lost or desperate enough to be traveling in this weather. Eleanor hesitated, but instinct stronger than reason pulled her to the door. She opened it to a rush of cold wind and rain. The rider approached slowly, head bowed under his hat, his duster soaked through, his lantern swinging from the saddle horn. When he reached the porch, he drew rein and looked up. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady despite the storm. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced. I'm looking for the Graves place. Heard it was just past Willow Creek." Her fingers tightened on the doorframe. "You found it," she replied softly. He nodded, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Name's Cole Everett. My father owned the Everett Ranch down south. He and your husband, well, they did some business together before he passed. I came to speak with Mr. Graves about the north pasture, but I suppose—" "You suppose right," she interrupted, her throat tightening. "Henry's gone, I heard," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry for it. He was a good man." The storm cracked overhead again, lightning tearing open the sky. The horse snorted and stamped in the mud. She glanced at the boy, for he couldn't have been much older than 25, and saw how the rain had turned him half to shadow. His face was strong but kind, his eyes clear and searching. "You'd better come in," she said after a moment. "You'll catch your death out there." He dismounted and led his horse to the porch post, tying the reins before stepping into the doorway. The warmth of the house wrapped around them like an old quilt, though it did little to hide how empty it felt. Cole removed his hat, ran a wet hand through his blonde hair, and gave her a nod that was polite, almost bashful. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said, water dripping from his coat onto the floorboards. "Just thought I'd stop by, pay my respects. My father passed not long ago, too. I know how that silence feels." Eleanor gestured to the fire, small and flickering low. "Sit," she said. "You can dry off some before you go back out there." He thanked her and crouched near the hearth, holding his hands toward the flame. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The storm did all the talking, wind howling through the eaves, rain hammering the roof. She found herself watching him, studying the way the light played over his features, the determined jaw, the youth still untouched by regret. He carried something in his posture that was both weary and proud, like he'd seen enough loss to understand hers, but not enough to have surrendered to it. "How old are you, Mr. Everett?" she asked finally. 25, ma'am. Been running the Everett lands by myself since Pa passed. Ain't easy, but it keeps me from thinking too much. She nodded, recognizing the sentiment. That's what work does. It keeps the ghosts at bay for a while. He looked up, meeting her eyes across the firelight. You believe in ghosts, Mrs. Graves? I live with one, she said quietly. Every time the wind blows, I hear him. Every time the cattle low at dawn, I think he's just outside the door. Cole's expression softened. Maybe he's just watching over you. Some folks say the ones who loved us most never really leave. She wanted to believe that, but belief felt like a luxury she'd buried alongside Henry. Maybe, she said instead. When the clock struck midnight, the storm began to ease. The thunder rolled farther off. The rain slowed to a whisper. Cole stood and set his hat back on. I should head back, he said. Didn't mean to trouble you. It's no trouble, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. But the road will still be muddy. You'll lose your footing in that dark. He smiled faintly. I've ridden through worse, ma'am. But maybe I'll stop by tomorrow if that's all right. See if the fences held through the storm. She hesitated. It had been months since anyone had spoken to her like that, simply kindly, without pity. Tomorrow, then, she said softly. He tipped his hat, then disappeared into the mist and rain, the lantern bobbing once more into the darkness. Eleanor closed the door and stood there, listening to the silence he left behind. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel quite so hollow. Something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the air after thunder, still heavy but waiting for light to break through. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of his voice, the warmth of his words. She wasn't thinking of death or loss, not this time. She was thinking of a stranger with kind eyes who had reminded her for one fleeting moment that she was still alive. Morning came gray and quiet, and the land glistened with the remnants of rain. When she stepped outside, she found footprints near the corral, his boots, she was sure. He'd returned early, maybe to check the fences, maybe to see if she'd survived the night without drowning in memory. She didn't see him, but she felt his presence in the still air, steady and patient. And so began the rhythm that would carry them through the days to come. The young heir and the grieving widow, their paths crossing under the weight of shared silence and unspoken need. He came each day, fixing the gate, mending the roof, offering small talk that grew into long conversations by dusk. And each night she lay awake again, restless in a way she hadn't been since before the fever took her husband. 5 nights without rest, not from grief this time, but from something stirring quietly within her. Something she didn't yet dare to name. The days that followed moved with a rhythm Eleanor hadn't felt in years, sunrises that bled gold over the wet hills, the sound of boots on the porch, and a voice calling her name with quiet steadiness. Cole Everett came back every morning without asking permission, always with a task in hand. Fixing the fence, clearing the fallen branches by the creek, checking the horses that Henry once bred with care. He worked like the land was his to save, though she'd never asked him to. At first, she told herself it was just neighborly kindness, that the boy had pity in his heart for a lonely widow left to fend for herself. But there was something in the way he looked at her. Not pity, not charity, but understanding. He saw her not as a woman broken by loss, but as someone still standing in the ruins, holding what she could together. That look made her heart stutter every time. By the second week, folks in town had begun to notice. The old storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, mentioned it with a smirk when she came for supplies. Heard young Everett's been spending time up your way, he'd said, weighing her flour. Good lad, that one. Shame folks might start talking if he don't mind his hours. Eleanor had met his gaze, her face unreadable. Let them talk, she'd said, taking her parcel. Talk's all most folks have left to feel alive. Still, that night, lying awake, she thought of those words. She wasn't ashamed, only confused. She had spent half her life learning what love meant with Henry. Patience, steadiness, devotion through the storms and seasons. But whatever was blooming now between her and Cole didn't feel like what she'd known before. It wasn't patient. It wasn't steady. It was a quiet fire that flickered in the hollow of her chest, where grief used to live. Cole came again at dawn the next morning. The sun had barely climbed over the ridge, and she was out feeding the chickens when she saw him riding up. He dismounted, smiled faintly, and held up a basket. "Brought you breakfast," he said. "Cook's been fussing since I told her you barely eat." Eleanor raised a brow. "And what makes her think she knows what I do?" He grinned, scratching the back of his neck. "Might have told her myself." She wanted to scold him, but his boyish charm disarmed her. "You shouldn't concern yourself with me, Cole.